I had been planning a long hike for months, something that would take me far away from busy roads, cities, and the constant noise of daily life. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be in the middle of nowhere with only trees, wind, and dirt trails around me. I picked an area of thick forest that stretched for miles, with old logging roads and hiking paths that weren't well marked. It wasn't a national park with crowded trails. It was just state forest land, rough and wild. I packed carefully. I had a decent backpack, a tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, and enough food to last me 4 days. I carried a small water filter too, because I knew there were streams scattered across the forest. I checked my map over and over again. The plan was to start from a gravel road that cut into the woods, follow a series of marked trails for about 15 miles, then cut across some unmarked sections of old logging road that eventually looped back around. It would be tough, but I thought I could do it. I had hiked before, but never this deep. The first day was calm. The air was warm, but not too hot. Birds moved in the trees, and the forest floor was soft with layers of leaves and pine needles. My boots sank into the dirt as I climbed slow hills and came back down again. I stopped often to check my map and compass, always making sure I was on the right track. The trail markings were simple painted blazes on trees. At first, they were easy to follow. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot by a stream and set up camp. The air cooled fast once the sun started to sink. I boiled some water, made a simple meal, and sat listening to the stream running over rocks. The quiet of the woods was heavier than I expected. In the city or even in small towns, there's always a hum, cars, voices, lights glowing somewhere. Out there, when the sun dropped, it felt like the world folded in on itself. Just trees, black sky, and water moving in the dark. I lay in my tent and told myself I would get used to it. The next morning, I packed early and pushed deeper. The trail climbed higher and the forest got denser. I saw no one. The trail signs grew less frequent. I had to slow down to study my map and make sure the compass still pointed me in the right direction. Every mile I walked, the forest grew thicker and more wild. The trees blocked out more sky. I thought about how far I already was from the gravel road, from any house, from anyone else. By the second night, I was tired. I had covered a lot of ground. My shoulders hurt from the weight of the pack, and my feet burned with blisters forming. I found another place to camp, this time on a slope above a small hollow. I built a small fire, nothing large, just enough to boil water and keep me company. The firelight threw shadows that looked like figures moving between the trees, but I knew it was just the flames twisting. Still, I sat closer to the fire than I normally would have. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up at every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves. I thought it was just animals, maybe deer moving through, but my nerves felt raw. Every sound seemed closer than it should have been. I pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin and forced myself to wait until morning. On the third day, things changed. I left camp and followed the trail uphill. I was supposed to find the old logging road that would cut me back toward the loop. The map showed it clearly, a long faded path that once carried trucks hauling timber out of the forest. But when I got to where the map showed it, the trail was gone. The ground was covered in thick brush. Trees had grown where the road should have been. I searched back and forth, walked up and down the hill, but there was no clear road at all. I knew I should have turned back right then. I should have gone back down to the last clear marker I had seen. But I thought maybe if I kept moving north, I would run into the road again. I pushed through brush, dragging my pack against branches, sweating and swearing under my breath. The ground sloped up and down, and I started to lose track of direction. I pulled out my compass, but the needle swung strangely. It didn't seem steady. I tapped it, shook it, but it wavered. The more I walked, the less sense the forest made. Everything looked the same. Trunks of trees, patches of moss, thick piles of leaves. I turned in circles more than once, convinced I had just walked past the same fallen log again. Hours slipped by like that. My water bottle grew lighter, and my food supply was now carefully rationed. By evening, I admitted to myself that I was lost. I tried to calm down. I still had food, water, gear, and daylight for maybe 2 more hours. I I found a flat patch between two large rocks and set up camp. I ate a small amount of food, conserving the rest. I sat in the growing dark and felt my chest tighten. That night, I barely slept again. Something moved around my camp, too close. I heard crunching in the leaves, deliberate and slow, like footsteps. My heart raced. I gripped my knife and held it against my chest, lying still inside my sleeping bag. I told myself it was deer, maybe even a bear, but the steps felt too measured, too much like something circling. I stayed awake until the sky turned gray. The next day, I tried again to find my way out. I moved fast, not caring about following trails, just heading in what I thought was the right direction. The forest thickened. My pack grew heavier. My legs ached, and every sound behind me made me spin around. By afternoon, I stumbled across something that stopped me cold. In the middle of the forest was an old fire ring, just a circle of rocks blackened by soot. Beside it were scraps of wood, some cut with an axe long ago. It looked abandoned, but not ancient. Someone had camped there at some point. I studied the ground, but saw no footprints, no gear, nothing recent. I felt uneasy standing there, like I was trespassing. I didn't stop long. I kept moving and found myself going downhill into a hollow. The air grew cooler, damper. The ground sucked at my boots with mud. I crossed a trickling stream and climbed the opposite side, only to realize the slope on the far side was steep and slick. I slipped twice, banging my knee on a rock. My body ached, and my nerves were stretched thin. By that evening, I was exhausted and scared. I found a flat area under pine trees and dropped my pack. I didn't bother with a fire. I just lay inside my tent, too tired to eat. Then I heard it again, the same slow crunching outside my tent. At first I thought it was my imagination, the same fear replaying in my head. But then it circled, moving steadily around me. I held my knife again, shaking. The steps paused, then moved off into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning I forced myself to move. My face felt pale and hollow from lack of sleep. My limbs shook. I climbed a ridge and finally saw open sky beyond the trees. I hurried toward it, hoping it meant a clearing or a road. But when I reached the top, it was just another endless stretch of forest rolling on and on. That was when I felt real panic. I had no idea where I was. My map no longer made sense, and my compass spun weakly. My food was running low. I thought about staying in one place and waiting, but no one knew exactly where I was. The trailhead I had started from was miles away, maybe days. The following days blurred together. I moved through thick forest, always hoping to find a road or sign of people. My food dwindled to almost nothing. My body grew weaker and my thoughts darker. At night, I heard the footsteps again, always circling. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eyes, just branches swaying, maybe, but it always felt like something keeping its distance. On the fifth night, I decided not to set up the tent. I rolled myself in my sleeping bag on open ground, thinking maybe if I could see the stars, I would feel less trapped. I stared up at them, the only light above me, and prayed that the morning would bring something different. But again, the sounds came, this time closer. I lay frozen, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped my knife and waited, staring at the dark line of trees. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke with sunlight on my face. I forced myself up and moved on. My body felt like it was shutting down, each step heavier than the last. By what I think was the seventh day, I stumbled out onto something that didn't belong in the forest. It was a dirt road, faint with grass pushing up through the middle, but still a road. My knees almost buckled with relief. I followed it, dragging my feet. After an hour, I saw a parked truck in the distance. My throat tightened. I waved my arms and stumbled forward. The man who owned the truck was startled to see me. He said I looked like I had been wandering for days, which I had. He gave me water, then drove me to the nearest town. From there, I finally got home. The experience never left me. The forest wasn't haunted. There were no ghosts or monsters, but being lost that deep, hearing something move around me at night, feeling watched without seeing anything, it was worse than anything I had imagined. I think it was just animals, maybe deer or a bear curious about me. Maybe it was even another person camping somewhere nearby. I had been planning this hike for months. It wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary, just a long loop through the mountains that I had been wanting to test myself on. The trail was known for being rugged and rarely traveled. That was the main reason I wanted to try it. I wanted quiet. I wanted to see how far I could go without seeing another person. I carried all the essentials. A backpack with food for 2 days, water, a small filter, extra clothes, a map, a compass, a flashlight, a headlamp, and a sleeping bag strapped to the bottom. The morning I started out, the air was cool and clear. The sun had just risen, and there was still dew on the grass near the trailhead. The trail itself began in a wide dirt path that slowly narrowed as it climbed upward into the trees. My legs felt strong, and for the first couple of hours, the hike was everything I wanted it to be. Quiet, steady, and peaceful. The first sign of trouble was how quickly the trail thinned out. I had known it wasn't popular, but within the first mile, the path looked like it hadn't been walked in weeks. Twigs and branches had fallen across it. In some places, plants had grown right into the middle. I found myself stepping carefully, checking the ground with each step. By noon, I was high enough that the trees grew closer together. Their branches blocked most of the sunlight, and the ground became damp. The dirt under my boots turned darker, softer. I had marked my progress on the map and was confident I was still on the right route, but I realized how easy it would be to lose the trail entirely. As the hours went by, the forest grew denser. The air felt heavier. The trail climbed steadily, zigzagging along the slope of the mountain. My breathing grew louder, and every sound carried far in the stillness. I could hear my own heartbeats when I stopped to rest. I could hear water dripping from leaves onto the ground. By late afternoon, I was beginning to feel a bit uneasy. The trail had narrowed to little more than a strip of compacted dirt winding between rocks and roots. On my left, the slope rose up sharply into thick brush. On my right, the ground dropped away, first steeply and then into a sheer drop into the valley below. I kept close to the uphill side, leaning slightly inward as I walked. I had planned to hike about 10 miles before setting up camp, but the trail's conditions slowed me down. It was closer to evening when I realized I wouldn't make my original spot. I needed to find somewhere flat enough to rest before dark, but flat ground was rare along this narrow trail. It clung to the side of the mountain like a scar. Finally, I found a spot where the trail widened out into a ledge just big enough for me to sit. I didn't have much of a choice, so I cleared a space, rolled out my sleeping bag, and sat with my back against the rock wall. From where I sat, I could see the valley stretched far below. It should have been beautiful, but as the light faded, the depth of it made me feel exposed. I ate a quick meal of jerky and trail mix, then lay down, listening to the sounds of the mountain as night came on. That first night, I hardly slept. Every crack of a branch, every shifting sound in the trees, kept me awake. It was probably animals, maybe deer, maybe smaller things, but alone in the dark, it all felt much closer than it probably was. My flashlight beam only stretched so far, and beyond it was endless black. By morning, my body was stiff, but I was relieved to see the sun climbing over the ridge. I packed quickly and pushed on. The trail grew even more difficult. Sections had crumbled away, leaving only narrow footholds of loose rock. I moved slowly, testing each step before putting my full weight on it. In one place, the dirt gave way under my boot, and small rocks clattered down the slope. I froze, pressing my body against the wall until I steadied myself. By midday, I had only covered a few miles. My map told me I was nearing the highest part of the loop. The trail would curve over the ridge and then slowly descend into forest again. That thought kept me going. But the higher I climbed, the more dangerous it became. The trail shrank to less than a foot wide in places. The drop beside me seemed endless. At one point, I had to press myself sideways along a stretch where the wall jutted out, leaving barely enough space for one boot at a time. My backpack scraped against the rock, threatening to throw off my balance. My palms sweated as I gripped cracks in the wall, inching along slowly. My chest tightened until I finally reached a wider section and could breathe again. I knew then how far I was from safety. There was no easy way back, and going forward meant more of the same. That night, I found no good place to rest. The best I could do was wedge myself between two rocks just off the trail. I sat upright, knees to my chest, sleeping in short bursts. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the trees above. It made the narrow ledge feel even more exposed. When morning came, my stomach felt hollow. I forced down some food and kept walking. The trail wrapped higher and higher until I reached the ridge. For a moment, I thought things would improve. The ridge was broader, and the view stretched in every direction. But the descent was worse. The other side of the loop had suffered more damage. The path down was crumbled in places, washed out by rain. Some sections were nothing but loose gravel that slid under my boots. More than once, I had to crouch low, using my hands to steady myself as I slid downward, stones tumbling ahead of me. My legs shook with effort. My shoulders ached from carrying the pack. By afternoon, I realized I had made a mistake. I had underestimated this hike. The trail was too dangerous and I was too far in. I needed to get out before I ran out of food or before I slipped in the wrong place. I checked the map again. If I kept following the loop, it would eventually level out into a valley trail that led back to the main road. But it was still many miles away. That third evening was the hardest. I was exhausted, and there was no flat ground at all. I ended up sleeping on the trail itself, curled against the wall, afraid of rolling too close to the edge. The night was colder at this altitude, and I shivered in my bag. My water was running low, and though I could hear streams below in the valley, there was no way to reach them. By morning, my throat was dry, and my steps felt heavy. My body ached everywhere. Still, I forced myself forward. The trail twisted downward through sharper switchbacks. In one place, I slipped on a patch of gravel and slammed my knee into the rock. Pain shot through my leg, and I had to sit for a long time before I could move again. The swelling started quickly, and every step after that was agony. The day dragged on with no relief. My progress slowed to a crawl. The map told me I should be nearing the valley trail, but the ground around me stayed steep and unforgiving. My knee throbbed with each step. I could feel blisters forming on my feet. By the time the sun began to set again, I was desperate. I needed water. I needed somewhere safe to rest. My flashlight beam shook as I walked. Every shadow looked like a drop. Every sound made me flinch. Sometime deep in the night, I finally saw it. A wooden marker half buried in weeds, pointing toward the valley. Relief flooded me. The path it marked was overgrown, but it was wider, sloping down instead of hugging the cliff. I pushed myself onto it, limping with every step, but knowing I was closer to safety. The descent felt endless. My knee screamed with pain, my throat burned with thirst, and my pack dug into my shoulders. But little by little, the trees grew taller around me. The ground softened underfoot. The sheer drops faded away. When dawn broke, I stumbled into a clearing where a shallow stream ran over rocks. I dropped to my knees and drank until I was coughing. Then I filled my bottles, splashing water on my face and arms. For the first time in days, I felt human again. The valley trail was still long, but it was manageable. It followed the stream, winding gently downward. The forest opened in places, letting in sunlight. Birds called overhead, a sound I hadn't noticed in days. By afternoon, I reached the dirt road that led back toward the trailhead. My body was beaten, my knee swollen, my lips cracked, but I was out. I had made it. I never returned to that trail again. The map I had carried now sits folded at the bottom of a drawer, edges still marked with sweat and dirt. I sometimes take it out and look at the line I traced with my finger, remembering every narrow ledge, every slip, every moment I thought I wouldn't make it. It taught me more than anything else I've done outdoors. It taught me how quickly things can go wrong, how fragile balance can be on the side of a mountain, how silence can press down heavier than noise. Most of all, it taught me to respect the weight of solitude. Out there, every step was mine alone. Every mistake could have been final. And though I made it back, I know I will never forget the feeling of being trapped on that narrow trail, the valley yawning below, the rock wall scraping against my shoulder, with nothing but the sound of my own breath keeping me company. I had planned the hike weeks in advance, though I had not truly thought about how isolated it might feel once I was out there. I wanted something that would take me away from crowds, away from noise, away from roads and houses. I wanted the kind of trail where you walk for hours without hearing anything except wind in the trees and the crunch of your own boots on dirt and stone. I had been hiking for years, though never alone for this long. Something in me kept pushing for it, though. The challenge, the quiet, the idea of disappearing into the woods and seeing if I could handle it on my own. The trail I picked was not well known. It was marked on a few older maps, but most hikers in the area stayed on the more popular routes with established campsites and clear markings. This one cut deeper into the forest, looping up through old ridges before dropping back toward a river valley. From what I had read, it had been used more in the past but fell out of popularity once bigger, easier trails opened up nearby. That suited me just fine. I left early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. My pack was heavy with gear, tent, food, stove, water filter, extra clothes, first aid kit, everything I thought I might need for 2 nights out. The air was damp and cool, and I could see mist hanging low in the trees as I drove down the old gravel road that ended near the trailhead. When I parked, there were no other cars. The silence sat heavy. For a moment, I considered whether I wanted that kind of quiet, but I pushed the thought away and started walking. The first miles were beautiful. The trail wound through tall pines, their trunks thick and straight, their crowns blocking much of the sky. The ground was soft with needles, and birds darted from branch to branch overhead. I moved quickly, energized by the morning air, and enjoyed the rhythm of walking alone. Every now and then I stopped to take in the sound of running water or the distant call of a bird. It felt like exactly the kind of solitude I had wanted. As the hours passed, the trail grew less clear. Sections were overgrown with brush, and sometimes fallen trees blocked the path. I had to climb over them or walk around them, sometimes losing the faint tread of the trail before finding it again. I paid close attention to landmarks, making mental notes of boulders, bends, or trees that stood out. I told myself I was fine, that I had a map and compass, that I was experienced enough. Still, the deeper I went, the more it felt like the forest was swallowing me whole. By midday, I reached a ridge. From there, the forest opened a little, and I could see across a sea of trees stretching for miles in every direction. No houses, no roads, no smoke from cabins, just endless green. I sat down, ate a quick meal, and drank water. My shirt was damp with sweat, though the air was cool. For a while, I just sat there, letting my legs rest. It felt good, though a small part of me wondered how far away help might be if I needed it. I shook that thought off quickly. The ridge descent was steep. The ground was loose, and I had to watch every step. My knees began to ache. It was in that section I realized how little use the trail saw. At times, it disappeared entirely under deadfall. I had to backtrack several times just to find the right way down. By the time I reached the bottom, the light had shifted toward late afternoon. My legs were sore, and I was ready to set up camp. I followed the sound of running water until I reached a creek. It was narrow but steady, cutting through moss-covered stones. I filled my bottles, filtered water, and then looked for a flat spot to pitch my tent. I found one on a rise above the creek, surrounded by trees. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I set up the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and cooked a small meal as the light faded. By the time the forest was fully dark, I was zipped into my tent, listening to the sound of water and the faint rustle of leaves. I expected to sleep well, but the night dragged on with little rest. Every snap of a twig outside, every rustle of leaves, made my body tense. The forest sounded different in the dark, louder, closer. At one point, I heard heavy steps not far from camp. Likely a deer, I told myself, but the sound of it moving through brush kept me awake. I eventually dozed, though my sleep was shallow and broken. When dawn came, I was already awake. I made coffee, packed up camp, and set out again. The trail beyond the creek was harder to follow than the day before. Sections were almost invisible. I had to check my compass often, and I felt the weight of every step more than I had before. Still, I pressed on, determined to complete the loop. Around midday, I came across something strange. The trail dipped into a hollow where the ground was damp and soft. There, half sunk into mud, I saw the rusted frame of what looked like an old metal container. Maybe a hunting blind, maybe something left behind decades ago. The sight of it unsettled me. It reminded me that people had been here long before me, and not all of them had reasons as simple as hiking. I moved past quickly, though the image stayed in my mind for hours. The forest grew thicker. At times I felt like I was pushing through walls of brush more than following a path. My arms and legs were scratched, my clothes dirty with mud. The map suggested I should eventually climb back toward another ridge before looping down toward the valley where my car was. But the terrain was confusing, filled with gullies and ridges that looked alike. Late in the afternoon, I realized I was no longer on the trail. I stopped, heart pounding, and turned slowly in a circle. I saw only trees. I tried to retrace my steps, but the ground was a mess of leaves and brush. No clear prints, no tread of a path. I pulled out my compass and checked the map. I thought I knew which direction to head, but doubt crept in quickly. What if I was wrong? What if I walked further from the trail instead of back to it? The forest seemed larger now, heavier. Every sound felt closer, sharper. I kept moving, following the compass, trying to stay calm. But as the light faded, panic pushed at the edges of my mind. I had not planned to camp again so soon, but I had no choice. I found a patch of ground that was somewhat flat and quickly set up my tent before it was fully dark. That night was worse than the first. The sounds outside were constant, branches cracking, something moving through the brush, the long silence broken by sudden rustles. I lay still, gripping the knife I kept in my pack. My heart beat so fast I thought it might burst. At some point, I realized I had been holding my breath for long stretches without noticing. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly. Sleep barely came. When dawn broke, I was exhausted but alive. I forced myself to eat and pack up. I told myself I only needed to stay calm, to keep heading in the right direction, to trust the compass. But the woods twisted endlessly, and I began to wonder if the map was even right. By midday, my water was running low. The sun filtered weakly through clouds, but the air felt damp and heavy. My legs ached with every step, and I could feel blisters forming in my boots. My thoughts circled between panic and determination. I told myself I could not stop, that stopping meant giving in, and that giving in meant real danger. Hours passed. At one point, I stumbled on an animal trail that seemed to head downhill. I followed it, hoping for water. Eventually, I heard the faint sound of rushing. Relief hit me, and I pushed forward until I reached another creek. I drank greedily after filtering, then sat for a long while, head in my hands. I tried to follow the creek, thinking it might lead to the larger river marked on my map. The terrain was brutal, the banks steep and slippery, but I forced myself along. I slipped often, my clothes damp and dirty. At one point, I cut my hand badly on a rock. Blood mixed with mud as I wrapped it with gauze from my kit. The day faded quickly in the trees. I had no choice but to camp again. Setting up the tent felt mechanical, my body moving without thought. That night, the noises returned. But now, my fear was joined by exhaustion so deep I could barely keep my eyes open. I drifted in and out of shallow, broken sleep. The next day, I kept following the creek. My body hurt everywhere. I had stopped thinking clearly, my mind fogged with hunger and fear. At times, I thought I heard voices, but I knew it was only the rush of water or the wind in the trees. By late afternoon, the creek widened. Then I saw it, the river, wide, cold, moving fast. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I followed it downstream, stumbling more than walking. Hours later, just as the last of the light faded, I saw something that nearly made me cry. A wooden bridge, not new, not in perfect shape, but clearly built for people. And beyond it, a faint line of dirt road. I staggered across, climbed up the bank, and collapsed onto the road. I lay there for a long time, staring at the fading light in the sky. I knew I still had miles to walk before I reached help, but the sight of that road meant I was no longer lost. I walked through the night, guided by the pale strip of road beneath the moon. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for weeks. The place I chose wasn't famous or crowded, which was part of the reason I picked it. I liked being away from noise, away from people, and somewhere I could just push myself and be alone with the land. The trail cut through a large gorge system in the western part of the state. It wasn't an official national park, but there were marked routes, and a few people I talked to before had said it was rugged but doable. I started out in the morning with my pack full of the basics: food, water, a small tent, first aid kit, flashlight, extra clothes, and a map. I thought I was prepared enough. I had done smaller hikes before, and I knew I could handle being alone for a couple of days. The weather forecast showed mild temperatures and clear skies, so nothing seemed like it could go wrong. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail wound down through wooded slopes, then dipped into the gorge where cliffs rose high on either side. The walls were jagged, covered in loose rock and thick brush. There were small streams trickling through, and the sound of birds was constant. I walked with a steady rhythm, pausing every now and then to take a sip of water or check the map. The gorge stretched farther than I expected, twisting and splitting into smaller paths that sometimes looked more like game trails than hiking routes. By midday, I realized the map wasn't lining up with what I saw. The trail markers were faded, some even missing, and at one fork I picked what I thought was the right direction, only to find myself on a narrow ledge above a drop-off. I had to backtrack, wasting almost an hour. That was the first time a knot of unease formed in my stomach. Still, I told myself it was fine. Getting turned around once didn't mean I was in trouble. As I kept walking, the gorge walls closed in tighter. The path dipped lower, and the sound of running water grew louder. Soon I came to a creek cutting across the route. The rocks were slick, and I had to take my time stepping over them. On the other side, the ground was damp and soft. The air felt cooler, shadows stretching longer even though it was still afternoon. I pushed on deeper, convinced that the trail would eventually loop back up to the ridge where I could camp for the night. But as I moved, the gorge seemed endless. I climbed over fallen trees, ducked under low rock shelves, and trudged through patches of thick mud. My legs burned, and sweat soaked my shirt. Each time I thought I saw a clearing ahead, it was just another bend, another wall of stone and brush. By late afternoon, I knew I was lost. I pulled out the map again, but nothing around me matched the lines and markings. The creek had branched into two, and I couldn't tell which was the main one. I tried climbing a slope to get a better view, but the rock was loose, and I slipped, scraping my arm. The cut stung, and blood trickled down, which only added to the rising stress. I decided to set up camp before it got dark. I found a flat patch of ground near the creek and pitched the tent. As the sun dipped behind the cliffs, the gorge filled with shadows, the temperature dropping fast. I cooked a small meal with the portable stove, but my stomach was too tight with worry to eat much. When night fell, the quiet was heavy. No distant highway, no houses, nothing but the faint sound of water moving and the occasional crack of branches in the dark. Lying in the tent, I couldn't shake the thought of how alone I was. If something happened, there was no one around to help. My phone had no signal. I had told a couple of people roughly where I was going, but not exact coordinates. That mistake sank into me like a stone. The night dragged on. Every little sound outside kept me awake. The rustle of leaves, the splash of something in the creek, the wind slipping between the rocks. I barely slept, and when dawn finally came, I felt heavy and slow. I forced myself up, packed my things, and tried again to find the main trail. The gorge twisted even more as I moved. I followed the creek downstream, thinking it might lead me out, but soon the banks narrowed, and I found myself walking through ankle-deep water. My boots grew soaked, every step heavier. The water grew deeper around each bend, forcing me to scramble onto the slippery rocks at the side. I was moving slower, wasting energy, and I knew it. By midday, hunger set in, but I rationed my food carefully. I didn't know how many more days I might be out here. My water filter kept me supplied, but the fear of being stuck for too long grew stronger. Later in the day, I heard something that froze me in place. A sharp cracking sound, like rock giving way. I looked up just as a chunk of stone broke free from the gorge wall above. It crashed down with a thundering noise, spraying shards across the ground. My heart raced as dust filled the air. If I had been a few steps ahead, it would have crushed me. That shook me badly. The walls were unstable, and I was trapped between them. I tried climbing again, desperate to get above the gorge. The slope was steep, covered with loose gravel and tangled roots. I clawed my way up several yards before sliding back down, scraping my legs. My hands ached from gripping rock, and one nail tore painfully. I sat at the bottom, breathing hard, realizing how weak I felt. That night, I didn't bother with the tent. I was too drained. I just laid out my sleeping bag on a patch of dirt, listening to the water and the endless stillness pressing in. My body shivered from the cold, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I thought about stories I'd read of people who vanished in the woods, found weeks later by search teams. I wondered if I'd be one of them. The next morning, I forced myself to keep moving, following the creek farther down. The gorge opened wider in places, then narrowed again. At one point, I stepped wrong on a slick stone and fell hard, my knee slamming against the rock. Pain shot through me, and I had to sit there for a long while before I could move again. Each step after that sent a jolt through my leg, slowing me even more. Hours passed, and then I spotted something, a piece of weathered wood sticking out of the mud. When I got closer, I saw it was part of an old footbridge, broken and rotting. My chest lifted. If there had been a bridge here once, it meant people had come through. Maybe it connected to a trail. I searched the area, scanning for any sign of a path, but all I found were faint traces of what could have been one long ago, overgrown now with grass and brush. Still, I followed the faint line, hoping it would lead somewhere. It climbed slightly, away from the creek, twisting through dense thickets that scratched my arms and legs. I pushed through, sweat pouring, my injured knee throbbing. At one point, I thought I heard something faint in the distance, a low rumble. It took me a moment to realize it was traffic. That sound filled me with new energy. I pressed harder, limping but moving as quickly as I could. The faint trail grew clearer, turning into a rough dirt path. And then, after what felt like hours, I saw the glint of metal through the trees. A guardrail. I stumbled out onto a roadside, collapsing against the steel barrier. My whole body trembled as I looked at the stretch of empty highway. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I had made it out. My clothes were torn, my skin raw with cuts and bruises, and I hadn't eaten enough in days, but I was alive and out of that gorge. I sat there for a long time, resting, until finally a car came by and slowed, the driver staring at me. Help had arrived. Looking back, I realized how close I came to disaster. A simple mistake, a wrong turn, and I had almost been swallowed by that gorge. I had thought of myself as prepared, but I wasn't. Out there, being careless meant risking everything. I learned the hard way that the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't care how confident you feel at the start. All it takes is one wrong step, and you can be lost, hungry, hurt, and desperate. That experience changed the way I hike forever. I never go out again without better preparation, without telling someone exactly where I'll be, without marking my path carefully. Because I know what it feels like to be alone in the gorge, with cliffs rising over you, the shadows closing in, and the fear that you might never find your way out. I had planned the hike weeks in advance. I had checked maps, weather forecasts, and trip reports until I was sure I knew what I was getting into. I had done plenty of long hikes before, though mostly on well-known trails where there were enough people around to give me comfort if something went wrong. This time, I wanted something quieter. I picked a trail that followed a narrow canyon system through a remote section of mountains. It wasn't marked as dangerous, but it wasn't exactly popular either. The appeal to me was that it was supposed to be isolated, rugged, and quiet. I wanted to get away from roads, noise, and people for a while. I drove up the mountain road early in the morning, reaching the trailhead before the sun rose over the ridges. The air was cool, sharp, and filled with the smell of pine. My backpack felt heavy when I pulled it on, but it was packed the way I always packed. Plenty of food, a water filter, layers of clothes, a small first aid kit, a knife, flashlight, and a lighter. I had a tent strapped to the bottom of the pack and a sleeping bag rolled up inside. I always packed like I might need to spend the night, even if the plan was just a long day hike. The first part of the trail was wide and well used, a dirt path with enough where that I could almost walk it without looking down. I pushed forward quickly, wanting to get some distance before the heat of the day came. The trail started climbing and narrowing as it cut deeper into the mountains. The sound of my boots against the dirt and small rocks was the only steady rhythm besides my breathing. Hours passed. The sun came up high enough to flood the canyon walls in light. Birds darted in and out of trees. My legs were burning from the climb, but it was the kind of burn that felt good, the kind that reminded me I was alive and moving. I stopped around mid-morning on a flat rock outcropping to drink water and eat some dried fruit. From there, I could see down into the canyon below, where a thin river wound between gray and brown stone. It looked wild and untouched, exactly the sort of place I had wanted to see. When I stood to keep moving, I noticed the trail ahead grew thinner, almost like it wasn't used often anymore. The dirt gave way to rock in places, and I had to step carefully to find the right footing. There weren't trail markers, but the path seemed to follow the canyon rim. The further I went, the less I felt like anyone had been here in a long time. Weeds grew in the cracks. Branches reached across the trail without being broken back. My progress slowed as I had to push through brush or scramble up over rock ledges. The feeling of isolation grew stronger. It was what I wanted, but there was something heavy about it too. When the wind died down, it was completely silent except for the crunch of my boots or the occasional sound of gravel rolling down the slope. I don't know exactly when I realized I had gone farther than I meant to. I had planned on reaching a certain point where the trail would split and form a loop back toward the trailhead, but I hadn't seen any split. Checking my map didn't help much, since the details of this area weren't drawn clearly. It only showed a line that seemed to follow the canyon. I figured if I kept going, I'd eventually see the loop or some kind of landmark. The sun shifted higher. The heat settled in. I was sweating through my shirt by the time I stopped to drink again. The canyon walls were steeper here, and the path had become little more than a ledge pressed against stone, with a sharp drop-off just a step away. My boots slid against gravel that wanted to roll off the side. I moved slow, bracing myself against the rock face whenever I could. At one point, I stopped and looked back. The trail behind me seemed almost invisible, swallowed up by brush and shadows. Ahead, it curved out of sight around the rock. I knew then that I had passed the point of comfort. Going forward might be faster than trying to go back. I kept moving. The ledge narrowed further, until I had to press my whole body against the rock to inch around sections. Below me, the canyon dropped straight down to jagged stone and dry patches of brush. My arms ached from holding myself steady. Sweat ran into my eyes, making them sting. Finally, the trail opened up slightly, just wide enough for me to step back and breathe. My legs were shaking. I sat down, pulled the map back out, and tried to match what I saw around me to the thin black lines on paper. Nothing fit. I realized the trail I was on might not even be the marked one anymore. Maybe it was a game trail or some abandoned route. That thought sank in heavy. Still, I didn't panic. I had food, water, and gear. I wasn't lost in the sense that I didn't know where I was. I was still in the canyon system, and I could follow the river down eventually. The problem was the way the terrain kept pushing me onto dangerous ledges. I stood again and kept moving, slower than before. The sun eventually began to tilt westward. Shadows stretched across the canyon. The light grew harsh and blinding where it cut through gaps, then deep and cold in the shade. I realized how long I had been walking. My legs felt heavier now. My water bottle was half empty. I had another full one in my pack, but the thought of running out here gnawed at me. Then I hit the section that stopped me cold. The ledge simply ended. The rock had crumbled away at some point, leaving a gap of about 6 feet. On the other side, the ledge continued. It wasn't impossibly far, but the drop below was sheer. If I missed, I'd be nothing but broken pieces on the canyon floor. I stood there staring at it, weighing options. My stomach tightened. I thought about going back the way I came, but the thought of inching along those narrow ledges again was worse. I lowered my pack, pushed it across the gap first, and watched it land safe on the other side. My mouth was dry. My arms trembled when I crouched, steadied myself, and leapt. My boots hit the stone on the other side. My body slammed forward against the rock wall, scraping my palms, but I made it. For a long time, I just sat there with my pack, breathing hard and shaking. After that, every step felt more dangerous. The trail didn't get better. It wound higher, steeper, until I realized I was being funneled upward rather than toward the canyon floor. Loose rocks gave way under my boots. In one section, the trail narrowed again, and when I tested it, the outer edge crumbled and fell straight down. My stomach dropped as I listened to the rocks rattle against the canyon walls for what felt like forever. I backed away. My heart was hammering. The reality hit me hard. The trail was gone. The only way forward was destroyed, and going back meant facing those same cliffs and ledges in reverse, now with less strength and less light. I knew then I would have to stay the night. I found a small flat spot back against the canyon wall, just wide enough to sit. I pulled off my pack and set out the tent, but the space was too small to pitch it. Instead, I pulled out the sleeping bag and sat wrapped in it against the cold stone. I chewed some jerky without really tasting it, washing it down with careful sips of water. The light drained from the canyon until it was black. The air turned cold fast. I listened to every sound. Rocks settling, wind shifting, something small moving in the brush below. My body ached from the day. My eyelids wanted to close, but I forced myself to stay awake for hours, afraid of shifting in my sleep and rolling off the ledge. When morning came, it was slow and gray. I felt stiff and weak. I forced myself to eat more food for energy. Then I studied the canyon below. The river was still there, glinting faintly. It was my only option. I began working my way down. It wasn't a trail. It was just scrambling down slopes of loose rock and brush, sometimes sliding on my backside, sometimes hanging from roots. Every movement was careful, deliberate. My hands bled from grabbing at sharp stone. My legs shook from the strain. Hours passed like that. Slowly, the river grew closer. At one point, a rock gave way under me and I fell. It wasn't far, just 6 or 7 feet, but I landed hard on my left side. Pain exploded in my shoulder. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My pack had cushioned part of the fall, but I felt something strain badly in the joint. I sat there gritting my teeth, testing the arm slowly. It hurt, but it still moved. I kept going. Finally, I reached the riverbed. The relief was overwhelming. I dropped to my knees beside the water and splashed it on my face, filling my bottles with filtered water. My whole body throbbed. I lay back on the flat stones and just let myself breathe. But the relief didn't last long. The riverbed wasn't an escape. It wound between steep canyon walls that rose high on both sides. The water was shallow in places, but deep and fast in others. The only way out was to follow it and hope it opened into a wider valley. I walked in the water where the banks were too tight, my boots soaking through. The cold bit into my legs. I slipped often on slick rocks, catching myself on bruised hands. The day dragged on, and the canyon showed no sign of opening. At one point, the water plunged into a chute of rapids that filled the entire gap. There was no way through. I had to climb up the rocks on one side, scraping myself raw just to get above the foaming water, then climb back. I always liked the quiet that came with hiking alone. The world felt stripped down to the sound of my boots pressing against dirt, the rustle of leaves stirred by wind, and the rhythm of my breath as I moved forward. I wasn't a professional hiker by any means, but I spent years on trails that wound through the woods and mountains near my home. Most times, I never thought much about danger beyond a twisted ankle or a scraped knee. What happened on that one trip, though, changed how I see hiking forever. The trip started out simple. I had planned to hike a trail I hadn't done before, one that was longer and quieter than the usual ones filled with weekend joggers and families. The trail was known to cut deep through a mountain forest, passing streams and rocky slopes, eventually looping back around to a dirt road that connected to the main parking lot. I packed what I thought was enough: 2 bottles of water, some trail mix, a small flashlight, a lighter, my pocket knife, and a thin jacket tied around my backpack. I figured I wouldn't need much more since I planned to finish the hike before sunset. The air felt crisp when I started, the kind that wakes you up as soon as it touches your skin. Sunlight came down in thin beams through the tall pines. The trail was narrow, worn down in places where roots pushed up through the soil. My pace was steady. At first, I felt excited to see new scenery, to feel that same freedom I always felt when I left roads and houses behind. The forest felt alive in a quiet way, the kind of life that doesn't call attention to itself but surrounds you all the same. After the first hour, I barely noticed how far I had gone. The path twisted through slopes, dipped down near a stream, then climbed again. The trees grew denser, shadows stretching across the trail. The farther I went, the more isolated it felt. I didn't see another person the whole time. Normally, I liked that, but I remember feeling a twinge of unease. The forest seemed so big, swallowing sound. I checked my watch and saw that I had plenty of daylight left, so I kept moving. The trail markers were faint, little rectangles of paint on tree bark spaced far apart. I followed them as best I could, though there were moments when I stopped and scanned the trees, trying to make sure I was still on the right track. My gut told me not to worry. At some point, the air shifted. Clouds must have drifted in because the light dimmed. The trees pressed tighter together. The quiet deepened too, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the thought and kept walking. My legs felt strong, and the air, though heavier now, still carried that sharp outdoor smell of pine and earth. A little farther along, I saw something that unsettled me. A piece of fabric, bright red, was snagged on a branch low to the ground. It looked like part of a shirt or maybe a bandana. I crouched down to touch it. The edges were frayed, as if it had been there a while, weather-worn and stiff. It wasn't unusual to see litter or scraps of things people dropped, but in that silent part of the woods, it felt out of place. I stuffed it into my pocket, not wanting to leave it hanging there, and kept going. The trail grew harder to follow. The paint markers became faint, some nearly rubbed away. I slowed, scanning the trunks. Twice I almost stepped off into what looked like a deer path, narrow and misleading. I had to backtrack a few times before finding the right way forward. That sense of unease crept higher. By the time I realized I'd been hiking longer than expected, the sky had started to shift colors. The pale blue was fading, replaced by the early signs of evening. I checked my watch again and felt a jolt of worry. I had thought the trail looped back sooner. Maybe I misjudged my pace. Maybe the trail was longer than I'd read online. Either way, I still hadn't seen the dirt road it was supposed to connect to. I picked up my pace. My boots crunched over dry leaves and rocks. The forest seemed darker with each passing minute. I didn't want to be stuck out there at night, not with no tent or sleeping bag. The trail dropped steeply down a slope covered in loose gravel. I took careful steps, leaning back to keep my balance. At the bottom, I reached another stream, this one wider and deeper than the first. The water flowed fast over rocks, dark and cold. I followed it downstream, hoping the trail would cross somewhere. The sound of rushing water filled the air, drowning out everything else. That's when I noticed footprints in the mud along the bank. They weren't fresh, but they were clear enough, boot prints like mine, though larger. For a moment, I felt relief. Someone else had been here, maybe recently. But then I thought about how the prints didn't continue forward. They wandered in circles near the stream, then seemed to vanish into the woods. No crossing, no continuation, just scattered marks leading nowhere. I tried to ignore it and kept following the stream until I found a narrow log wedged across 2 rocks. It looked stable enough, so I inched across, arms out for balance, and reached the other side safely. My boots sank a little in the damp ground, and I climbed back up the opposite slope. The forest grew even darker. Shadows thickened, swallowing the trail. I took out my flashlight and clicked it on, the thin beam slicing through the gloom. I hated how small the light felt, how much of the forest it couldn't touch. Every time I turned my head, the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the beam. My nerves sharpened when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. The path under my feet looked less like a trail and more like random packed dirt between trees. I slowed down, shining my light over trunks, searching for paint marks. Nothing, just bark and moss. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving forward in one direction. Panic would only make me lose track completely, but the forest pressed in harder with each step. The silence felt heavier, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the faint buzz of insects starting to rise with the night. The ground sloped upward again. I climbed, my legs burning, sweat damp on my back. When I reached the top, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Another piece of fabric, this one blue, was tied around a branch at eye level, as if placed there deliberately. It wasn't frayed like the red one. It looked newer, less weathered. My first thought was that maybe it was a marker left by another hiker, but the way it was tied, tight and purposeful, unsettled me. I pulled it off and shoved it into my pocket, forcing myself to keep walking. The trail, if it even was a trail anymore, curved sharply and dropped again. My flashlight beam caught strange shapes on the ground ahead, branches arranged in a way that didn't look natural. They were laid out in rough patterns, not quite circles but not random either. I froze, staring at them. Maybe kids, I thought. Maybe someone messing around. But out here, this deep in the woods, the unease in my chest grew heavier. I stepped around them carefully, not touching anything, and moved faster down the slope. My breath quickened. By now, the forest was completely dark. My flashlight lit only a small patch of ground at a time. The trees looked endless, their trunks stretching into blackness. Every sound seemed louder. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the faint splash of water far behind me. At one point, I swore I heard something moving parallel to me in the trees, faint but steady, like footsteps keeping pace. I froze, shining my light into the forest, but saw nothing but endless shadows. I pushed on, heart pounding, refusing to stop again. The woods felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting anymore. Felt watchful. The air grew colder. My thin jacket barely helped when I finally stopped to pull it on. My legs were tired, my water bottles half empty. I forced myself to ration, sipping only when my throat felt dry. Hours seemed to pass, though I couldn't tell how many. My watch showed time slipping by faster than I wanted to admit. Midnight crept close. I had no plan but to keep walking until I found something. A road, a cabin, anything. Then, through the trees, I saw light. Faint, flickering. Not the harsh beam of a flashlight, but the warm orange glow of fire. Relief shot through me. Maybe campers, maybe someone who could help me get back. I moved toward it, trying to be careful with my steps, pushing branches aside. When I got closer, my relief drained. The fire wasn't a campfire the way I expected. It was small, built inside a rough circle of stones. Around it, I saw more of those branches arranged in patterns, only larger, more deliberate. Some leaned against each other in shapes I didn't understand. The fire was low, as if it had been left untended, but it was still burning. No one was there. The sight froze me in place. I wanted to believe it was just someone's abandoned camp, but the way everything was laid out didn't look casual. It looked planned, organized. I backed away slowly, careful not to step on sticks. My skin prickled as if eyes were on me. From there, the night blurred into a long march. I didn't stop again, didn't dare. I just kept moving, forcing my body forward even when my legs shook and my throat ached with thirst. I don't remember how many hours passed. I don't remember how many times I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of hiking deep into the mountains had been sitting in the back of my head for a long time, and I finally decided to do it. I had been hiking before, but always on shorter trails, places where other people were around, where there was always a way to get back to the parking lot in a few hours. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to be far away, where I would have to rely on myself, where the trail was long enough to take more than a single day, and where there was no easy shortcut out if things got rough. I started preparing early. I packed carefully, making sure to bring everything I thought I would need. My backpack was heavier than I wanted it to be, but I felt safer with the extra supplies. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, water bottles, water filters, maps, a first aid kit, spare clothes, food that would last for several days, and a knife. My boots were broken in, my socks thick, and I carried trekking poles to steady myself on the rough terrain. The morning I started, the sky was clear. The air felt sharp and fresh, cooler than it had been down in the valley. I parked at the small trailhead, shouldered my pack, and set out. At first, the trail was wide, well-worn, and easy to follow. The trees stood tall on both sides, and the sound of birds carried through the branches. My steps felt strong, my breath steady. Everything seemed perfect, but I had chosen a trail that was known for being remote, one that wound up into the higher ridges, with steep switchbacks, narrow ledges, and long distances between camping spots. People wrote online about how quiet it was up there, how you could walk for hours without meeting another person. That was exactly what I wanted, though I underestimated how much that kind of silence could work on the mind. As the hours passed, the ground grew rougher. The trail narrowed, twisting along the side of the mountain, sometimes no wider than my boots, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. The sun climbed higher, and sweat dripped down my face. My legs burned as I pushed upward, but I kept going, resting only to sip water and check the map. I was aiming for a small clearing marked as a camping spot about 10 miles in. The first real unease started in the late afternoon. The forest changed as I climbed higher. The trees thinned out, twisted by wind and thin soil. The silence deepened until it felt heavy, as if the mountain itself was pressing down. My footsteps seemed too loud, my breathing too sharp. Every time I stopped to rest, I heard small rustles somewhere off the trail, but when I looked, nothing was there. Just shrubs and rocks, shadows between the trees. I told myself it was normal. Animals lived up here. Deer, squirrels, maybe even bears. The rustling was nothing more than that. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I adjusted my pack and walked faster, wanting to reach the clearing before dark. The trail dipped into a ravine where the air turned cold. The ground was damp and uneven, scattered with loose stones. My boots slipped a few times, but I caught myself with the poles. As I pushed through the shadows of the ravine, I noticed fresh prints in the mud. They were not boot prints. They were large, wide, and shaped like paws. The claws had left deep marks. I stopped and stared at them, my chest tightening. They looked recent. I told myself again that animals were normal here, that the prints didn't mean danger was close, but it was hard to shake the thought that something large might be moving through the same narrow space not far from me. I pushed out of the ravine and back onto a stretch of switchbacks. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was setting. The small open space sat on the edge of a ridge, with just enough flat ground for a tent. Beyond it, the slope dropped steeply into thick woods. I set down my pack, stretched my aching shoulders, and began to set up camp. The wind picked up as darkness fell. My tent rattled, and the trees creaked. I cooked a quick meal on the stove, but I ate without much appetite. The feeling of being watched had not left me. Every gust of wind carried a sound that made me glance up. The snap of a branch, the shifting of leaves, the scrape of something across stone. I tried to tell myself it was only the forest, that I was tired, that I was letting my nerves get the best of me. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, I expected sleep to come quickly. My body was exhausted, my legs sore, my eyelids heavy, but lying there in the thin nylon shell of the tent, every sound felt amplified. I could hear my heartbeat, my breath, the faint rustle of the fabric when I shifted. Then I heard it, something heavier than wind, heavier than branches. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, deliberate. They came from the tree line at the edge of the clearing. I froze, holding my breath. The steps crunched softly over dried leaves, pausing every few seconds, as if whoever or whatever it was listening. I told myself it could be a deer, but the rhythm felt too controlled. My throat went dry. I stayed perfectly still, listening, every muscle tight. After what felt like forever, the sound faded back into the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time my eyes drifted shut, a sound jolted me awake. By morning, I was stiff and anxious. I packed quickly, eager to keep moving. The trail beyond the clearing narrowed even more, twisting along the edge of cliffs and through stretches of thick forest where the light barely broke through. The second day was harder. My legs ached from the climb, and the trail demanded constant focus. In some places, the ground crumbled underfoot, and I had to test every step. At one point, the trail squeezed between two walls of stone so tight that my pack scraped against them. The sense of being trapped, with no view of what lay ahead or behind, made my skin crawl. By midday, clouds rolled in. The light dimmed, and the air grew heavy with moisture. I stopped to pull on my rain jacket, but I didn't want to rest for long. I felt exposed when I wasn't moving. That afternoon, I reached a section where the trail skirted a steep slope. Loose gravel shifted under my boots, sliding down into the trees far below. I planted my poles carefully, moving slow. Halfway across, a stone gave way under me, and I nearly lost my footing. My heart jumped as I caught myself, scrambling to steady my pack. For a moment, I thought I was going over the edge. The fear left me trembling, and I had to stop, pressing my back against the rock wall until I could breathe again. I told myself I needed to find a safe place to camp early, before exhaustion made me careless. A spot near water would be best, so I pushed on, scanning for signs of a stream. Late in the day, I found one, a narrow creek cutting across the trail. The ground nearby was soft but flat enough for a tent. I set down my pack and filled my bottles with filtered water. The air was damp and cool, the trees thick around me. It felt sheltered, but that shelter also made it feel closed in, as if something could be hiding just out of sight. I forced myself to eat, though my stomach turned with nerves. The silence pressed down even heavier here. I could hear the creek, the occasional drip of water from the leaves, but nothing else. No birds, no insects, just emptiness. That night, the sounds came back. Not just footsteps this time, but something brushing against the tent. The faint drag of fabric, the snap of a twig close by. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, clutching my knife, staring into the darkness. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just outside, slow, steady, human-like. But when I finally forced myself to unzip the tent and shine my light, nothing was there. The beam caught only the trees, wet and silent. By the third day, I was running on little sleep. My thoughts felt cloudy, and my nerves were frayed. Every shadow looked like movement, every sound like a threat. My legs shook on the climbs, and I stumbled often. Still, I pressed forward, telling myself the trail looped back toward the valley after another long stretch. If I could just keep going, I would be closer to safety. The weather turned worse. Rain began to fall in steady sheets, soaking through the canopy. The trail turned slick, mud clinging to my boots. My clothes clung damp to my skin, and my pack felt twice as heavy. I slipped more than once, catching myself with the poles, my heart racing each time. Then I found something that chilled me deeper than the weather. At a bend in the trail, I came across a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve. The edges were frayed and dirty, but not old. A little further on, I saw more, another scrap, and then a boot print pressed into the mud. The size was too small for mine. Someone else had been here. Recently, the realization hit hard. The footsteps I'd been hearing, the sounds around my tent. It hadn't been my imagination. Someone was out here, moving along the same trail, close enough to leave signs. And from the way they stayed unseen, from the way they moved at night, they weren't just another hiker. I didn't know what they wanted, but the thought of being followed by... I have been hiking for years, But the trip I am about to describe is the one that still keeps me awake at night. It was supposed to be a normal solo hike. I wanted quiet, open air, and long days of walking through the woods without a phone buzzing in my pocket. What I ended up experiencing was something very different, and I still think about how close I came to not making it back. It was late summer, warm but not too hot, with long hours of daylight. I picked a section of trail in the northern mountains that was not very popular. Most people I knew stuck to marked routes with clear signs and regular campsites. I wanted something less crowded, something that felt like I was truly out there on my own. I studied a map and found a trail that looped around through forest and ridges before reconnecting to a more popular route. It was marked on the older maps, but I didn't find much online about it, which honestly made it more attractive to me. I packed light but carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, small stove, water filter, first aid kit, extra food, and a paper map with a compass. I had my phone too, but I didn't expect signal for most of the trip. I told myself that was fine. I wanted to disconnect. I wanted to feel small compared to the land, like the hikers I had read about who wandered for weeks with nothing but what they carried on their backs. The first day was easy. The trailhead was quiet, and my car was the only one parked when I set off. The trail at first was wide, with roots and rocks but nothing difficult. The forest was green, light filtering through the canopy, and the air smelled of pine and soil. I felt strong. My pack rode comfortably, and my boots broke in quickly. I made good time, stopping only to drink water and eat small snacks. I saw no one, not a single hiker, which gave me a strange sense of ownership over the place, like I had stepped into a world that only existed for me. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing by a creek and set up my tent. The air cooled fast once the sun dropped, and the insects started to hum all around me. I boiled water, made a simple meal, and sat listening to the sound of the stream as darkness settled in. It felt peaceful, exactly the kind of escape I had wanted. When I lay down in my tent, I slept deeply. The second day was when things started to shift. The trail narrowed as I continued, less maintained than before. Fallen trees forced me to climb over or detour around them. Sometimes the path was overgrown, and I had to check the map and compass just to be sure I was still following the right direction. I didn't mind at first. It felt like real hiking, the kind of thing that tested patience and focus. But the quiet weighed on me more heavily. Birds called in the distance, but I saw little else. No hikers, no sign of anyone. It was as if the place had been abandoned. At midday, I reached a ridge where the trees opened up. From there, I could see the valleys stretching out, layers of green hills fading into the distance. It was beautiful, but also isolating. I knew that somewhere out there, miles away, people were driving cars and sitting in cafes. But from where I stood, it was just me and endless forest. I stayed only a few minutes before heading back into the trees. As the hours went on, the trail grew even less clear. Sometimes I found myself following what looked like faint animal tracks, then circling back to where I thought the trail should be. The map helped, but it was old, and I started to wonder if it was even accurate anymore. I told myself I was fine as long as I kept track of my bearings. I tried not to think about what would happen if I got completely lost. By evening, I realized I had not made as much progress as I had hoped. I found a small slope that seemed flat enough to set up camp and pitched my tent there. I was tired, more tired than the day before, my legs heavy from pushing through brush and stepping over logs. I ate quickly and crawled into my sleeping bag as the forest darkened. That night was the first time I felt uneasy. Lying in my tent, I became aware of how thin the nylon walls were, how close the forest pressed in. I heard noises, branches snapping, rustling in the brush, that I couldn't identify. Probably deer, I told myself, maybe small animals moving through. Still, every sound seemed louder than it should have been. I didn't sleep as easily. The third day began with a sense of determination. I wanted to push farther, reach the point where the trail looped back toward more traveled paths. According to the map, I should have been close, maybe a day away from reconnecting. But as the morning stretched on, I noticed something that bothered me. The trail was vanishing. At first, it was just faint, with grass and plants growing where feet once walked. Then, in places, it was gone altogether, leaving me guessing which way it had gone. I backtracked several times, scanning for blazes on trees or cut marks that hikers or rangers sometimes leave. I found almost nothing. I started to wonder if anyone had walked this path in years. The sun moved high, and heat pressed down through the canopy. My water supply ran lower than I liked, but streams were not always where I expected them to be. When I did find one, I filtered and refilled, but it slowed me down. My legs ached, and my shoulders burned where the straps of the pack dug into them. By late afternoon, I realized I was off the trail entirely. I had been following what looked like a faint track downhill, but when I stopped to check, it simply disappeared into thick brush. I stood there, sweating, my chest tight with a kind of quiet panic. I turned in circles, trying to find where I had come from, but the forest looked the same in every direction. I forced myself to stop and breathe. I pulled out the map and compass, tracing the lines, trying to match them with the land around me. I thought I had a general sense of where the main trail should be, so I picked a direction and started walking. The terrain grew steeper. Loose soil slid under my boots, and thorny plants grabbed at my legs. My arms stung from scratches, and sweat dripped down my back. Every time I thought I was making progress, the land twisted again, and I wasn't sure anymore. By the time the sun lowered, I was exhausted. I hadn't found the trail. I set up camp in a small hollow between trees, not because it was good ground, but because I didn't have the energy to go farther. My meal tasted bland, and I could barely eat half of it. When I lay down, I felt the weight of the situation pressing in. I was not where I should be. The map felt less like a guide and more like a piece of paper that might be lying to me. That night, I barely slept. The noises in the forest seemed closer. More than once, I sat up, straining to hear movement outside the tent. My flashlight beam caught nothing, just trees and shadows. My heart pounded anyway. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but it was a restless, shallow sleep. On the fourth day, I admitted it fully. I was lost. I had no trail, no markers, only general direction. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. People survive being lost in the woods all the time if they are smart. I still had food, though less than before, and water I could filter if I found streams. My best bet, I thought, was to keep moving in what I believed was the direction of the main trail. If I kept steady, I had to run into it eventually. But the land did not cooperate. Ridges forced me to climb, and deep gullies forced me to descend. Every climb drained my energy, every descent made me stumble. I tripped more than once, scraping my knees and hands on rocks. My clothes tore in places, and my boots felt heavier than ever. The forest itself began to feel different, dense, almost claustrophobic. The trees pressed closer together, and undergrowth tangled at every step. I felt eyes on me even though I knew it was only animals. Once, I heard a crashing sound in the distance, something large moving through, and I froze until it faded away. That afternoon, I slipped while crossing a slope of loose soil and slid several feet before catching myself against a tree. My shins struck hard against a rock, leaving a deep bruise that made every step afterward painful. I sat there for a long time, sweating, my hands shaking. I thought about how easily it could have been worse, a broken bone, something that would leave me unable to walk at all. The thought made my throat tighten. By the fifth day, I was in survival mode. My food was running low, and I rationed carefully. My body ached constantly, muscles tight, skin raw where my pack rubbed. I moved slower, every mile harder than the last. My mind played tricks on me, making me think I saw faint trails or man-made shapes in the distance, but when I got closer, it was always just nature. That night, I set up my tent in a low, damp area because it was the only ground flat enough. The air was thick, and mosquitoes swarmed around me. I ate the smallest meal yet, just enough to take the edge off hunger. Lying in my sleeping bag, I stared into the darkness for hours, feeling as if the forest was closing in around me. The sixth day was when things hit the worst point. I woke weak, my stomach aching from hunger, my head light. I walked with slow, dragging steps, barely lifting my boots. Around midday, I stumbled across what looked like the remains of an old camp. I always liked hiking alone. Something about being away from traffic, away from screens, and away from the endless background noise of daily life made me feel calmer than anything else. I wasn't an expert, not the type of person with climbing gear or survivalist training, but I knew my way around a trail. I could read maps, follow blazes, and carry what I needed. At least I thought I could. One October, I set out on a section of trail I hadn't done before. It was part of a long route that cut through forested hills, dipping down into valleys and stretching over ridges. The guide I read online made it sound challenging but not impossible. Long, with some rocky parts, and steep enough to burn your legs by the end of the day. The draw was that it was remote, far from any town or busy highway, which meant real quiet. That was what I wanted. Quiet. I started just after sunrise. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath when I parked the car at the trailhead. The lot was empty. My car was the only one sitting in the gravel clearing, facing the long wall of trees that would swallow me the moment I stepped onto the path. I should have been comforted by that, but for a second I wondered if maybe that wasn't a good sign. An empty lot meant no one else was out here. I shook it off and shouldered my pack. Inside I had water, food for the day, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and an extra layer. I had a paper map folded in the front pocket of my jacket and my phone fully charged, though I already knew service out here was spotty at best. I locked the car, tightened the straps on my pack, and walked into the woods. The trail was easy at first. Fallen leaves covered the dirt, muffling my steps. Sunlight pushed through the canopy in broken stripes, the air cool enough that I kept my jacket zipped. My breath came steady, my legs warmed up, and the world around me felt like it always did at the beginning of a hike, peaceful, slow, untouched. For the first hour, I barely thought about anything at all. I just walked, listening to birds, the crunch of my boots, and the occasional crack of a branch snapping somewhere off in the brush. It was the kind of sound that kept me aware but not nervous. Deer moved through here all the time, and smaller animals too. The first steep climb came just after a creek crossing. The trail bent upward through rocks and roots, rising like a staircase that had been torn apart by weather. My legs burned, but I paced myself, stopping once to sip water. At the top, I found a clearing where I could see across a valley. The ridge on the far side stood dark and sharp against the pale sky. It was beautiful, but also quiet in a way that made me feel how far I was from anything human. No voices, no cars, no chainsaws or barking dogs from a farmhouse down the road. Just wind sliding across bare branches. I stayed long enough to snack on a granola bar, then moved on. The further I went, the rougher the trail became. Fallen trees forced me to climb over or crawl under, and sometimes the blazes on the trunks were faded, making me stop to check my map. At one point, the trail narrowed along a slope, a steep drop hidden under loose leaves that threatened to take me down if I slipped. I hugged the uphill side and kept moving, careful with every step. By late morning, I had covered about half the distance I planned. My legs ached, my back felt damp with sweat, but I was doing fine. I picked a flat spot beneath tall pines and sat down to eat lunch. I chewed slowly, letting myself breathe, letting the silence wrap around me. That was when I noticed how still everything was. No wind, no bird calls. Even the usual insect hum had gone flat. For a few minutes I sat there, sandwich in hand, ears straining for anything. But there was nothing, just stillness. It made me uncomfortable, though I told myself it was normal. Sometimes the woods go quiet when predators are around. Sometimes it just happens. I packed up and kept walking, but the feeling clung to me. The trail dropped into a darker section of forest where the trees grew closer together. The ground was uneven, covered in rocks and roots, and the dim light made it harder to see where I was stepping. My pace slowed. I thought about turning around, but I kept reminding myself this was just a hike. I had plenty of daylight. I had a map. I had done things like this before. The uneasiness didn't leave, though. It only grew. About an hour later, I realized I hadn't seen a blaze in a long time. I stopped, scanned the trees, and frowned. Normally, the painted marks appeared every couple hundred feet, just enough to keep you on track. I hadn't been paying close attention. I pulled out the map, unfolded it carefully, and traced the line of the trail with my finger. The problem was I couldn't tell exactly where I was anymore. I had followed the trail, I was sure of that, but the switchbacks and small branches off the main route blurred together. I thought about retracing my steps, but when I turned around, the path behind me looked the same as the one ahead, dark, rocky, and vanishing into trees. I tried to stay calm. I picked a direction that seemed right and walked slowly, scanning trunks for paint. After 10 minutes, I still hadn't seen one. My stomach tightened. I kept moving. The forest pressed in heavier, the light fading though it wasn't late enough for sunset. My legs felt heavier too, each step louder in the silence. I started hearing things. Small cracks, faint thuds, soft movement in the brush. At first I thought it was just animals, but the more I walked, the more I felt like it wasn't random. It was following me. I stopped once, holding still, trying to catch it in the act. Nothing, just silence. I moved again, slower, ears straining. After a few steps, another crack behind me. My chest tightened. I didn't run. I forced myself not to. I walked faster though, eyes darting over every tree, every shadow. My hand gripped the straps of my pack like that would do something. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A boot print, fresh, pressed deep into the soft dirt. It wasn't mine. I stopped and stared at it, heart hammering. The tread was different, bigger, and there were more, leading down the same way I was going. I wasn't alone out here. For a second I felt relief. Maybe I'd find someone who knew the trail, someone who could point me back to the main path. But the relief vanished as quickly as it came. The prints weren't old. Whoever left them couldn't be far ahead. And if they were out here, why hadn't I seen or heard them before? I stood frozen, listening, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Finally, I kept going, following the same direction, but my steps felt shaky. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. Every time the trail dipped or turned, I expected to see someone waiting. The boot prints kept leading forward, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp in the dirt. They weren't spaced like someone hiking casually. Some looked longer, like the person had been striding fast. I walked slower, letting more distance build between me and whoever it was. Minutes turned to what felt like hours. My water bottle was half empty now. My stomach gnawed, but I didn't dare stop to eat. I just kept moving, following what I hoped was the right direction, until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A second set of prints. These ones were smaller, like a different person had joined. They overlapped with the first set, weaving close and then apart again, both heading the same way. I felt dizzy. Out here, on this empty stretch of forest, at least two people were moving ahead of me, and I hadn't seen them once. The uneasiness hardened into fear. The trail bent sharply downhill into a hollow. At the bottom, leaves covered everything, thick enough to hide holes and rocks. My feet slid a few times, and I caught myself on branches. At one point, I slipped completely and landed hard on my side. The pain shot up through my ribs, knocking the wind out of me. I lay there for a moment, gasping, ears ringing. When I pushed myself up, I noticed something on the ground a few feet away. It was a torn strap from a backpack. The fabric was frayed at the ends, dirt ground into it, but it hadn't been there long. The leaves underneath were freshly disturbed. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, frozen, listening. My heart hammered so loud I swore it would give me away. I picked myself up and climbed out of the hollow as fast as I could. Every step felt heavier, like the woods themselves didn't want me to leave. By now the light was dropping. The trees turned black against the fading sky, the air colder. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, the weak beam barely cutting through the dark. My legs shook, my mouth dry. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I would see someone standing there. I didn't, but I knew I wasn't alone. The prints, the strap, the noises, they all pressed down on me. My body moved on instinct now, faster, desperate. I stopped caring about blazes or the map. I just wanted out. The trail twisted endlessly. Ridges, hollows, thick patches of brush where my jacket snagged. My water ran out. My flashlight beam shook in my hands. The noises never left. Branches cracking, faint thuds, always just out of sight. At some point, I stumbled on I never thought a simple hike would end up changing the way I looked at the outdoors. I had been hiking for years, and most of the time things went smoothly. I liked the quiet, the fresh air, the way the trees moved in the wind. I liked the sound of water when I found a stream or a waterfall. I liked the smell of pine needles and dirt after rain. I liked the long silence that came with being far away from traffic, phones, and all the noise that filled normal life. I had planned this hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a challenge, but nothing extreme. The route was listed as moderate to hard on a few trail websites. It was a loop trail that cut through forest, climbed up a ridge, crossed a mountain pass, and then looped back down through valleys and switchbacks before returning to the start. The full distance was a little over 20 miles. I had done trails of similar length before, though not always with the same elevation gain. I packed carefully, brought enough food, and filled my water bottles. I had my map, compass, flashlight, knife, first aid kit, and rain jacket. I made sure everything fit in my backpack without too much weight. The morning I started was colder than I expected. Mist hung low in the trees and clung to the ground. The dirt on the trail was damp but firm. Birds were just starting to call as the sun pushed weak light through the gray sky. My boots felt solid with every step, and the pack sat tight on my shoulders. I told myself I would keep a steady pace and finish the loop before evening. I wanted to be back at my car by dark, maybe even before dinner. That was the plan. The first hours were peaceful. The trail wound through tall trees with trunks so straight they looked like pillars, moss-covered rocks, and the air had that cool, earthy smell that always felt good to breathe in. I followed the markers nailed to trees, red paint circles that showed I was on the right path. The climb started gentle, then steeper as switchbacks took me higher. My breath got heavier, but my legs felt strong. Sweat dampened my shirt, and I pulled my cap low as the mist began to lift. By late morning, I was higher on the ridge, and the forest opened in places where rock outcroppings jutted out. From there, I could see valleys below, dark green stretches with rivers shining faintly through them. The mist had burned off, but clouds still moved fast above. I stopped for water and a snack, checked the map, and felt confident I was making good time. The ridge trail narrowed in sections with steep drop-offs hidden behind brush. I stayed careful, planting my boots firmly. After another hour, the trail entered a thick section of woods again. The trees blocked most of the light, and it grew darker, even though it was midday. The air here was cooler and quiet. My footsteps sounded louder. I noticed the trail looked less used. Fallen branches and patches of ferns spread across the dirt. I looked for the red paint markers but didn't see them for a while. My stomach tightened a little. When I finally saw another marker, I felt relief. But soon after, the trail split. One path looked more worn, the other narrower and covered with leaves. The map didn't show a clear fork here. I hesitated, checked the compass, and chose the more worn path, assuming it was right. At first it seemed fine, but as I followed it deeper, the dirt became soft and overgrown. The path narrowed until it felt more like a game trail than a hiking one. I stopped, looked around, and realized I hadn't seen a marker for a long time. I walked back a little, but the trail seemed to vanish into the forest. I told myself to stay calm. I pulled the map out, looked at the contours, and tried to match the land around me. The problem was that everything looked the same. Trees, undergrowth, slope after slope. I thought I could cut across and reconnect with the loop further down, but the forest was dense, and I couldn't see far ahead. I pressed on, pushing through brush, ducking under branches. My arms scratched, and twigs caught on my clothes. The ground sloped downward, rocky in places, soft in others. My boots slid on loose dirt. I stopped again to check the compass. According to it, I was moving south, which seemed right if I wanted to connect with the lower part of the loop. But the more I walked, the less certain I became. Hours passed, and the light began to change. The forest grew quieter. I realized I was sweating hard, but at the same time a chill crept up my back. I hadn't seen the trail for a long time now. I was off it completely. I tried to climb a slope to get a better view, but all I saw at the top were endless trees and ridges folding into each other. No sign of clearings, no sign of the loop. Panic pressed at the edges of my thoughts, but I pushed it down. I had food, water, gear. I could handle this. I decided I would keep moving until evening, then set up a place to rest. I walked carefully, marking trees with small cuts from my knife so I wouldn't circle back. The forest floor grew uneven, with hidden holes and rocks. I stumbled more often. The sound of running water reached me, and I felt a wave of relief. Streams often connected to trails or valleys. I followed the sound until I reached a narrow creek tumbling over rocks. I crouched, refilled my bottle, and drank deeply. The water was icy cold, almost shocking in my throat. I looked around the creek bed, hoping to see signs of human presence, but there was nothing. The sun lowered behind the trees, casting long shadows. My body felt sore from climbing and pushing through brush. I decided I couldn't keep going safely in the dark. I searched for a flat spot and cleared branches and rocks until I had a small area big enough to sit and lie down. I pulled out my jacket, sat with my back against a tree, and ate some food. The forest darkened fast. Sounds of birds faded, replaced by distant cracks and rustles. Night in the forest always felt different when alone. Every noise carried, every movement made me tense. The cold settled in, and I wrapped the jacket tighter. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by waking in fear at small sounds. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, but it might have been branches shifting. My heart hammered so hard I could barely breathe. I held my knife in my hand until exhaustion pulled me back into uneasy sleep. Morning light came gray and thin. My body ached from the hard ground. I ate a little food, drank water, and tried to plan. I still thought moving downhill was best, since valleys often led to roads or bigger trails. I followed the creek, stumbling over rocks, wading in shallow water when banks were too dense. Hours dragged by. Hunger gnawed at me and my legs grew heavier. The forest seemed endless. The more I walked, the more hopeless it felt. At one point, I slipped on wet rock and fell hard on my side. Pain shot through my ribs, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I lay there staring at the sky through the trees, feeling panic rise. I forced myself up, wincing, and kept going. By the second night, exhaustion was crushing. I found another spot to rest, though it was cold and damp. My food was running low, and fear tightened in my chest. I thought about my car sitting in the lot, about the people who might eventually notice I hadn't returned. I wondered how many days before someone searched, how far I might have wandered from the main loop. The third day was worse. My steps dragged, my throat was dry, and my stomach cramped with hunger. I forced myself to drink water, but it didn't stop the weakness. I followed the creek until it widened into a small marshy area. The ground sucked at my boots, mud pulling me down. I pushed through reeds, swatting at insects, until I finally reached firmer ground on the other side. Then finally I saw it, a faint line through the trees. I stumbled forward and found an actual trail, narrow but clear, with signs of human footprints. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I followed it, every step shaky but determined. After an hour, the trail widened, and I saw fresh markers. My chest swelled with hope. By evening, I reached a junction with a wooden sign, pointed toward the parking lot, still a few miles away, but I didn't care. My legs moved with new strength, fueled by the thought of escape. The forest grew lighter as the trees thinned, and soon I saw the glint of metal through branches. My car. The sight almost didn't feel real. I reached it, dropped my pack beside it, and leaned against the door, shaking with relief. My body was battered, my clothes torn, my hands scratched raw, but I was alive. I had made it back. That hike taught me something I'll never forget. Trails aren't guaranteed. Maps don't always match the ground. A wrong turn can change everything. Out there, panic is as dangerous as anything else. I survived because I kept moving, because I didn't give up, but it could have ended very differently. Even now, I think back to those nights in the forest, alone in the dark with every sound pressing in. I know how close I came to not making it out, And I know I'll never step onto a trail again without remembering the feeling of being lost, with no path in sight, and the desperate fight to find my way back. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for months. I wanted to test myself to go far out into the backcountry and see if I could handle a full week alone. I had done plenty of day hikes, a few weekend trips, but never more than 2 nights on my own. When I finally got the chance to take time off, I picked a mountain range several hours away. It wasn't the tallest range or the most dangerous one, but it was remote enough that I knew I wouldn't see many people once I went in. That was exactly what I wanted: quiet, distance from the world, and the chance to feel the land in a raw way. I drove up early in the morning, reaching the trailhead just as the sun started to break over the ridges. I had packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 6 days, water filter, map, compass, headlamp, spare batteries, and a small first aid kit. My pack was heavy, but it sat well on my back. The air was cool, crisp, and I remember thinking how perfect it all felt. The first 2 days passed in calm silence. I hiked slowly, taking in the valleys, streams, and the steep climbs up switchbacks. I passed maybe 4 people in total, all of them heading back down toward the trailhead, finishing their own trips. By the time I reached the high country, I was truly alone. I set up camp near a small alpine lake on the second night, cooked noodles on my stove, and watched the water darken under the stars. On the third morning, I broke camp and pushed deeper into the wilderness. The trail thinned and sometimes disappeared into patches of snow or fields of rock. I checked the map often, making sure I was still heading the right way. My plan was to loop around one of the higher ridges, cross a long valley, and then make my way back to the trailhead from the other side. It was ambitious, but I thought I could manage it. By late afternoon, clouds began rolling over the peaks. I had expected some weather, but I wasn't ready for how fast it built. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped quickly. I hurried to find a place to camp before the storm hit. The trees had thinned out as I gained elevation, and I was close to the ridge. I finally spotted a narrow patch of flat ground tucked near some large boulders. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I set up my tent just as the rain started. The sound of it beating against the fabric grew louder with each passing minute. I crawled inside, zipped it shut, and tried to relax. The storm raged for hours. I barely slept. At some point during the night, I heard rocks shifting higher up the slope. I froze, listening. It could have been falling from the storm, but it kept going, a kind of crunching and sliding that made me picture something moving on 2 legs. I told myself it was just the wind knocking loose stones. Still, I barely slept. In the morning, the storm had cleared, but the sky was still gray. I packed up quickly and started hiking again, but the trail became harder to follow. Large sections were covered in broken rock. The map showed I was near the ridgeline, and I needed to cross it to drop into the next valley. As I moved higher, I noticed fresh tracks in the mud near a small patch of snow. They weren't boot prints. They were wide, uneven, with claws pressing into the soft ground. A bear, I thought immediately. The size told me it was big. My stomach tightened. I moved more carefully now, making noise as I walked, banging my trekking pole against rocks to let anything know I was there. Hours passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every sound behind me made me glance over my shoulder. When I finally crested the ridge, I felt relief, but the descent looked rough. Steep switchbacks cut into loose dirt, dropping sharply into the valley below. Halfway down, the trail simply disappeared. A landslide had torn through, leaving a slope of unstable rock and dirt. I checked my map. There was no alternate marked path. If I wanted to continue, I had to cross it. Turning back would mean days of retracing. I weighed my choices and finally decided to attempt it. I moved slowly, placing each step carefully, testing the ground before shifting my weight. The slope shifted under me several times, sending stones clattering down. My heart pounded, but I kept moving. Then I heard something. It came from above me, somewhere higher up the slope. A sharp sound of rock cracking, sliding, then silence. I froze, waiting. Another crack, then a scatter of gravel rolling downhill. I looked up. Through the gray light, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape shifting between the rocks. My first thought was the bear again. I shouted, hoping the noise would scare it off. The sound echoed and died. No response. I kept going, faster now, scrambling across the unstable slope. When I finally reached the other side, I collapsed onto solid ground, my legs shaking. I looked back, but the slope was empty. I told myself it was just more loose rock. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something had been up there, watching me. I pushed on, deeper into the valley. The walls of rock rose high on both sides, and a stream cut down the middle. I followed it until I found a flat patch of ground beneath some trees and set up camp. My nerves were frayed, but I tried to settle in. I boiled water, ate a simple meal, and sat watching the shadows creep across the valley walls. Just before dark, I saw movement again. Across the stream, maybe 100 yards away, something moved through the trees. It wasn't a bear this time. It was upright, human-shaped. For a moment I felt relief, another hiker, maybe. But then I realized how strange it was. There was no trail here, no easy way down into this valley except the broken slope I had crossed. Whoever it was had come from somewhere else. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. The figure paused between the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Then it slipped out of sight. My chest tightened. I waited, but it never reappeared. That night was one of the longest of my life. I lay in my tent, wide awake, every sound magnified. Branches cracked, rocks shifted, and the wind carried strange patterns. I kept gripping the handle of my knife, knowing it wouldn't do much if someone, or something, decided to come close. Hours crawled by, and somehow I drifted into light sleep. At dawn, I packed up and started hiking again. My plan had been to spend another 3 nights out, but now I just wanted to get back. The valley stretched long, and the map showed a trail that would eventually curve around and head toward the main path back to the trailhead. I moved quickly, scanning the trees constantly. Around midday, I spotted another sign that made my stomach sink. On a patch of soft dirt near the stream, there were prints. Human prints this time. Bare feet, large, pressed deep into the ground. I crouched to study them. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a day or 2 at most. I felt my throat go dry. For the rest of that day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, faint, just beyond clear hearing. Each time I stopped, the sound stopped too. I would wait, heart pounding, then force myself to keep going. When I set up camp that night, I did it hastily, without even cooking. I wanted to be hidden. I pitched the tent close to thick brush, almost concealed. I ate a handful of dried food without boiling water, then crawled inside and waited for darkness. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of water splashing. The stream was only a few yards away. Something was moving in it, slowly, deliberately. I held my breath, straining to hear. The splashing stopped. Then, faintly, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel, coming closer. I didn't move. My chest felt like it was going to burst. The steps came closer, then paused. For a long time, there was only silence. Then I heard a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled along the ground. My skin crawled. Minutes passed. Finally, the sounds drifted away, back toward the stream. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife, staring at the thin wall of the tent. The first light, I tore down camp and started moving. I pushed myself harder than ever, hiking fast, barely stopping for water. I just wanted out. The trail wound along the valley and began to climb again toward the higher ridges. The higher I went, the more exposed I felt. Every time I looked back, I expected to see someone following. By late afternoon, I reached a high pass. My map showed that beyond it, the trail would drop into a long forested stretch that eventually linked back to the main route out. I paused at the top to catch my breath, scanning the valley behind me. For the first time all day, I saw something clear. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, far below, upright, watching. I didn't wait. I started down the other side, moving as fast as I could. I kept checking over my shoulder, but the figure never followed into view. Still, I didn't slow down until darkness forced me to stop. That night, I camped in dense forest. The trees closed in so tightly I felt